A European trader laughs while guards tally crates. Convinced Africans lack discipline or strategic authority. African port officials stand upright, weapons shouldered, watching every movement without responding. The trader keeps laughing because the belief protects him and excuses his assumptions. A clerk pauses mid-entry as an African commander inspects seals, weighs cargo, and recalculates tariffs. The clerk waits for permission before writing again, eyes fixed downward, hands suspended above parchment. Negotiation begins without raised voices, only measured silence and armed proximity. What follows is recorded by hands that hesitated, enforced by people who decided, and preserved reluctantly. Every action is traceable through living witnesses, ildrasapes, and delayed approvals. Consequences unfold through procedure, not spectacly. African officials control the shoreline through posted guards, inspection tables, and enforced harbor rules. Merchants queue under the sun, while African officers verify licenses, stamps, and authorized cargo lists. A ship captain protests quietly, then complies when inspection continues without acknowledgement. Recognition begins with posture, as African commanders stand elevated during port assemblies and dispute hearings. European agents remove hats, not from respect, but to reduce attention while awaiting decisions. African tax collectors move deliberately, escorted, marking ledgers before signaling armed confirmation. A customs officer rejects a shipment for improper weights, sealing the decision with a visible mark. The ship remains anchored, sails slack, while merchants calculate losses in whispers. Authority is recognized because refusal carries immediate economic consequences. African courts convene near ports, with seated elders and standing guards controlling access points. Witnesses wait outside rope boundaries, while scribes record rulings announced without debate. European representatives submit petitions through translators, who pause to ensure exact wording compliance. Documentation follows recognition, as receipts, licenses, and stamped permissions circulate through coastal networks. An African scribe rolls parchment, applies seal pressure, and hands copies to waiting messengers. Each document authorizes movement, trade, or detention, and each carries enforcement weight. Merchants learn quickly that paper issued inland overrides promises made aboard ships. A European factor offers gifts, which are catalogued, assessed, and returned pending formal review. Silence functions as a procedure, not indecision. African inspectors board vessels with measured steps, counting barrels and cross-checking manifests. A captain attempts an explanation, but inspection continues without interruption or eye contact. The inspection ends when the inspector decides, not when explanations finish. Licensing restricts access, as African authorities reduce docking privileges for non-compliant traders. Guards redirect boats towards secondary piers, extending wait times without explanation. Merchants watch preferred berths assigned to compliant rivals, learning enforcement through delay. Restriction tightens through toll adjustments announced publicly, then enforced privately. A toll collector recalculates fees while armed escorts reposition slightly closer. Payment is made without argument, because refusal is already answered. European traders gather privately, discussing cost increases and unpredictable approvals. They draft letters requesting standardized terms, signed cautiously, and sent through official channels. Responses arrive late, formal, and unchanged. Reinterpretation begins quietly as European clerks rephrase African authority in their internal correspondence. A port commander becomes a local intermediary within their descriptions. An enforcement action becomes customary practice, stripped of sovereign implication. African officials continue issuing orders, unaware that their authority is being renamed elsewhere. A treaty table is set, with African negotiators seated centrally and guards flanking. European envoys nod, record terms, and request copies for home offices. The treaty is enforced locally through patrols, inspections, and sanctioned penalties. Merchants comply because penalties are immediate and visible. Reinterpretation does not alter enforcement on the ground. Institutional pressure increases as European companies coordinate complaints across ports. A petition references an inconsistency while omitting African decision-making structures. Clerks align language carefully, removing titles and emphasizing commerce over governance. African rulers receive the petitions and respond through official audiences. Responses reaffirm authority, restatic procedures, and attach sealed confirmations. The exchange remains formal, controlled, and documented. Restriction escalates when African authorities limit certain trade goods to licensed partners. A warehouse gate closes after inspection results, redirecting traffic elsewhere. Affected merchants wait outside, calculating lost days without confrontation. European agents observe patterns, mapping enforcement routines and approval timelines. They note which offices authorize, which delay, and which never reconsider. Information becomes a tool for later administrative challenge. Reinterpretation deepens as reports frame African enforcement as obstacles rather than governance. A delay becomes inefficiency within corporate memoranda. A refusal becomes unpredictable in shareholder briefings. African institutions continue functioning, issuing licenses, collecting taxes, and enforcing penalties. Guards rotate shifts, clerks maintain records, and messengers carry sealed orders inland. Nothing appears unstable within the system itself. Institutionalization begins subtly as European companies standardize internal responses to African authority. They instruct agents to document interactions extensively, anticipating future disputes. Paper accumulates as leverage, not compliance. A European officer requests clarification on an inspection protocol, phrased as assistance. The African inspector responds by pointing to posted regulations and resuming work. The officer records the gesture, not the rule. Recognition remains intact locally, but reinterpretation accelerates externally through coordinated reporting. African authority is acknowledged in action, while diminished in description. This duality creates space for later intervention. African officials enforce quarantine measures during illness outbreaks near ports. Ships are held offshore while guards patrol piers to prevent unauthorized contact. Merchants protest quietly, then submit to inspection schedules. European correspondence reframes quarantine as excessive control rather than public enforcement. Language shifts without altering immediate compliance. The reframing is administrative, not confrontational. Restriction evolves into conditional access as European firms accept limited permissions. They trade reduced margins for continued presence. Compliance becomes strategic patience. African courts adjudicate disputes between traders, issuing fines collected immediately. European litigants pay, receive receipts, and depart without appeal. Authority remains visible and effective. Institutional coordination intensifies as European states review accumulated reports. Committees examine language choices, not enforcement outcomes. They question titles, jurisdictions, and recognized capacities. African authority is now documented extensively by those preparing to challenge it. Every inspection, delay, and refusal is archived for reinterpretation. The archive becomes a weapon. The moment shifts when European institutions begin standardizing terminology across reports. African rulers are labeled regional leaders rather than sovereign authorities. The change exists only on paper. For now, ungoverned enforcement continues unchanged, guarded, documented, and complied with. Above it, institutions prepare to reframe power systematically. The reframing moves from language into procedure without announcement or a public confrontation. European offices circulate new forms that omit African titles, while preserving transaction details. Agents are instructed to comply locally while contesting authority administratively. African port officials notice no immediate change in posture or compliance. Ships still wait, inspections still occur, and tolls are still collected under guard. Power continues, operating visibly, but it is no longer described honestly elsewhere. Documentation becomes selective as European clerks summarize interactions instead of transcribing them fully. An inspection becomes a routine check rather than an exercise of jurisdiction. A refusal is logged as a temporary obstruction pending further clarification. African scribes continue issuing licenses with seals pressed firmly and witnessed publicly. Messengers deliver copies inland, while coastal officials file duplicates for reference. Their archive is meant to preserve authority, not anticipate erasure. European companies establish liaison desks dedicated solely to African trade disputes. Staff are trained to delay responses, request clarifications, and escalate paperwork upward. Delay replaces confrontation as the preferred tool. A merchant challenges a toll assessment through a written appeal rather than refusal. The appeal is acknowledged, filed, and left unanswered beyond the shipment's deadline. The merchant pays to avoid loss, then records the delay as a grievance. Restriction expands through administrative review cycles, introduced externally. European offices require agents to submit African-issued licenses for verification abroad. Verification takes weeks, long after enforcement already occurred. African officials observe compliance slowing without obvious resistance. Ships arrive prepared to wait, having adjusted schedules around anticipated delays. Enforcement remains unchanged, but its impact weakens gradually. Reinterpretation hardens as European legal scholars publish analyses questioning African jurisdiction. These texts circulate internally, shaping policy assumptions without field verification. Authority is debated far from those enforcing it. African courts continue ruling on disputes, unaware their legitimacy is being quietly contested. Fines are collected, receipts issued, and guards ensure compliance without escalation. Nothing collapses locally. Institutionalization accelerates when European governments adopt standardized trade regulations. The regulations reference African regions as zones rather than governed territories. Compliance remains required, but recognition is removed from the language. European naval officers begin appearing as observers during port inspections. They stand back, record timings, and note procedural steps without interference. Present replaces negotiation. African commanders acknowledge observers with nods, then continue enforcement. Guards do not adjust formation, and inspections proceed methodically. Authority is exercised without seeking validation. European reports now include comparative tables, measuring delays, tolls, and enforcement outcomes. African procedures are presented as inefficiencies relative to European administrative norms. The comparison ignores enforcement effectiveness. Restriction is reframed as obstruction in diplomatic correspondence. African authority is treated as a variable to be managed rather than respected. Policy begins shifting accordingly. African rulers receive formal notices proposing revised trade frameworks. The language emphasizes cooperation while redefining oversight roles subtly. Meetings are requested rather than demanded. Negotiations occur under familiar structures, with African officials seated centrally again. Documents are exchanged, reviewed, and taken for external approval. Enforcement continues unchanged during deliberation. European delegations delay responses after meetings, citing required consultations abroad. African authorities wait, enforcing existing rules without adjustment. Silence becomes asymmetrical. Institutional betrayal begins when provisional agreements are implemented selectively. European agents comply with favorable clauses while contesting others administratively. African enforcement addresses violations case by case without a broader context. Erasure advances as European maps label African polities. Ports retain names, but governing structures disappear from annotations. The change affects planning, not immediate interaction. African officials notice an increased presence of foreign administrators near ports. These administrators carry papers authorizing oversight, not enforcement. They observe, report, and wait. Restriction now operates through parallel authority claims. European administrators question enforcement decisions after compliance occurs. Challenges are filed externally, beyond local resolution. African courts rule as before, but appeals are redirected abroad. Decisions remain enforced locally, yet their permanence is undermined. Authority holds briefly, then dissolves administratively. Institutional coordination tightens as European states align diplomatic pressure. Trade concessions are offered in exchange for oversight acceptance. The exchange is framed as modernization. African rulers deliberate internally, weighing enforcement capacity against sustained pressure. Guards remain posted while councils debate procedural adjustments. Power strains without visible collapse. Reinterpretation becomes policy as European laws define African governance. As customary administration, the definition reduces authority without altering daily operations immediately. Erosion is delayed, not denied. European naval patrols begin enforcing navigation guidelines near ports. They do not enter harbors, but their presence alters traffic flow. African inspections adapt without confrontation. Documentation shifts decisively as European records become primary references internationally. African-issued documents are treated as local permits rather than sovereign licenses. Recognition narrows. Erasure is formalized when treaties are reclassified as trade arrangements. Clauses guaranteeing authority are reinterpreted as logistical coordination. The reinterpretation is codified. African enforcement encounters increasing procedural challenges from merchants. Compliance continues, but disputes multiply beyond local resolution. Time becomes the constraint. Institutionalization completes as European administrations assume regulatory oversight roles. African officials are invited to participate as advisors rather than authorities. Participation replaces control. Guards still stand, but their jurisdiction shrinks incrementally. Inspection outcomes require external confirmation to carry a long-term effect. Authority is conditional. Modern consequence emerges as historical records privilege European documentation. African enforcement actions appear as obstacles within archived narratives. The visible power disappears from history while having governed reality. Ports that once enforced through African authority now operate under layered administration. Procedures remain, but the origin is obscured. Power persists without acknowledgement. The threat was never physical force alone. It was a functioning authority that resisted absorption quietly, procedurally, and effectively. The institutions did not defeat it openly. They renamed it, delayed it, and archived it till recognition vanished.